Dark Rising Studios. In this video, I'm going to teach you all about how to use brick stitch. Brick stitch is a really cool fill stitch that you can use to fill in any area on your design. It ends up looking like rows of bricks stacked one on top of another, and I'll be teaching you how to do this in a nice straight formation and also how to use brick stitch by filling in a round or curved area. I'm really excited to show you how to use this one. Let's get started. There are a couple of different ways to do brick stitch, and I'm going to show you my favorite way first. This involves using backstitch, so if you don't know how to do backstitch, head over and watch that tutorial before watching this one. To fill this space with brick stitch, I'm going to first begin with a horizontal line of backstitch that goes all the way across the bottom edge of my shape. My goal here is to fill this entire rectangle with horizontal brick stitch. So I'm starting here at the bottom and just doing a line of backstitch first. Think of this row of backstitch as your first layer of bricks in the shape. So once I get to the end here, I'm going to actually return to the same side that I started. You don't have to do this. If you want to turn around and add your next layer of bricks by going in the other direction, so right to left instead of left to right, you can do that. But I'm going to go back to the side I started on, and I'm going to place another stitch directly above my first stitch in that first row. This stitch will be half the length of the stitch underneath. So I'm making a half stitch here. I'm making sure the edges line up on the edge of the shape that I'm trying to fill. And from here, I'm going to do another completely regular line of backstitch that sits directly on top of my first one. Make sure that these two lines of backstitch touch each other. You don't want to leave any visible fabric in between the two. And you want to make sure that the ends of your stitches in this new row line up with the middles of your stitches in the row underneath. So the stitch ends are offset from one another. Offsetting the ends of your stitches like this is what gives the layers that nice brick look. Continue adding rows of backstitch one on top of another. Your third row of backstitch is going to have stitch ends that line up exactly with those in the first row and are offset by those in the second row. Remember, on every other row, you're going to need to start your row off with a half length stitch. I'm going to go ahead and stop working on this shape and show you how to do another method of brick stitch in the rectangle above. Okay, so the other way you can do a brick stitch is by stacking individual stitches on top of one another and varying their lengths. So you would begin by one single full length stitch here in the bottom corner, and you'll follow that up with a half length stitch stacked right on top of it. Again, you're always working up to the edge of whatever shape you're filling in. Make sure there's no visible gap or fabric showing in between these two stitches. On top of the half length stitch, you'll stack another full length stitch. So your first and third stitches will have ends that line up. Follow this one by a half length, and I think you get the idea. You'll continue this method all the way up to the top of the shape. Now that I've just about reached the top of my rectangle, I have the option of either turning around and adding the second column by going back down, or I can return to the bottom and work my way up again. So I've returned down here to the bottom, and I'm going to add another full length stitch after the one I have here. From now on, you can actually just add full length stitches. Since you started your second row with a half length stitch, by adding a full length stitch, you'll be sure that the ends of your stitch are offset. I'm going to keep adding this second column of stitches, and as I bring my needle up through that unstitched edge, I'm making sure to always bring it back down through the stitch that comes before it. You can continue adding columns of stitches in this way until your entire space is filled. This method is more traditional than the way that I showed you at first, and I generally use the first way when I'm doing brick stitch because I find it's a little bit more flexible when I'm doing shapes that are not just a straight sort of rectangle. In my own work, I find myself doing way more brick stitch on shapes that are rounded. So here I'm going to show you how to do brick stitch in a circle. You'll begin by doing a ring of back stitch all the way around the circle. Once you've completed your first ring, you're going to add another ring of backstitch just inside the first one. Begin by offsetting the ends of your stitches from where you started in the row before. So that'll make the ends of the stitches in my previous row hit the centers of the ones I'm adding now. Make sure you keep these rings really close together. Again, you don't want any visible fabric or gaps in between the two rows. Continue adding rings of backstitch one inside of the other to create a circular brick stitch effect. As you work your way toward the center of a circle, your stitches are going to end up getting smaller and smaller. If you find that some of your stitches are getting too small to manage and that the stitches you're having to add inside them are ridiculously little, you can go ahead and occasionally skip a stitch. Do a double length stitch across two of the stitches in the row above, and then keep going with regular size stitches. You can do this pretty easily without it being noticeable in the finished fully stitched circle. I hope you find these tips for brick stitch really useful for all of your embroidery projects. You can see some examples of brick stitch here in this design. I've used brick stitch to fill in this area, starting by making a ring around the outside and adding rows, gently working toward the center. It creates a really nice effect, and I love the way it looks. I hope you have fun with brick stitch.